I traveled over 900 miles to see my daughter get married. I took with me the blue dress I had chosen with such care. But when I arrived in the city, I discovered the wedding had already taken place. 2 days earlier. She hadn't forgotten me. She had deliberately erased me. And at the altar, in my place, stood her father, the same man I had spent my entire life portraying as a villain. In that moment, my legs gave way, and the truth, cruel and unexpected, began to swallow me whole. I left before dawn, when the city slumbers and the streetlights cast long shadows on the sidewalk. The air smelled of brewed coffee and damp asphalt, and I clutched my blue dress to my chest as if protecting a secret. "Everything will be okay," I whispered to myself, as if blessing my own courage. The bus station felt like a profane church. Hard benches, tired people, promises hanging from suitcases. I bought the ticket with trembling hands, and the ticket booth attendant wished me a safe trip, unaware that I was carrying a world. I boarded the bus with a lump in my throat and a thread of hope tied to it. For the first kilometer, I felt the engine roar like an old, stubborn heart, the kind that's been beaten by life and still keeps beating. I leaned my forehead against the window and let the landscape pass by. Gas stations, quiet farms, little houses with colorful clotheslines. Sometimes I closed my eyes and imagined the moment I'd see my daughter in white, the hem of her dress brushing the ground, the music starting softly. I said a short, simple prayer, asking for peace to find us at the altar. And I promised myself to be quiet, to not give opinions, just to embrace, just to love. That's all. Dawn turned into morning without asking permission, and the light entered the bus like an invitation. A lady sat next to me and offered me mints. I accepted one, just to sweeten my tongue, which insisted on making up words I shouldn't say. "Is it a wedding?" she ventured, with that instinct of someone who recognizes disguised joy. I nodded with a wry smile, tucking the remnants of my pride into my coat pocket. I didn't tell her anything about the past, nor about the rubble we sweep under the rug. I spoke only of the blue dress. I spoke of flowers. I spoke of music. Every sign on the road seemed to tell me a chapter, and I read it like a child. I remembered my daughter's first tooth, the notebook with the teddy bear cover, her fear of thunderstorms. I also remembered my harsh words, the rush, the "we'll talk later," that so often turned into never. Memory is a blade that cuts as much as it illuminates, and on that bus bench I bled softly. I promised, again, that it would be different, that I would learn to speak softly, that I would learn to keep my voice down, that I would learn to be quiet at the right time, that I would learn, finally. Halfway there, the rain came suddenly, thick, seeming to wash the road clean. The windshield wipers sang a hypnotic tick, and I found myself praying without realizing it, as if apologizing for having taken so long to understand. I smelled the perfume of the blue dress escaping from the plastic, a faint scent of a new store, of the beginning of a story. I imagined my daughter laughing, her eyes shining, and a desire to hug her surged through me. "I'm coming," I thought, as if she could hear my thoughts. As if the words flew through the crack in the window. The driver turned the radio on low, and an old song filled the aisle, the kind that talks about promises, letters, waiting by the window. It gave me a silly shiver, a good one, and I put my hand to my chest to hold back my heart that wanted to race ahead of the bus. Time, there, seemed elastic. With each memory a snap, with each snap a desire to apologize, a desire to say, "I was wrong," without pretense, a desire to say, "I'm here," without defense, a desire to say, "Let me try again." We stopped at a gas station for coffee, and the smell of toasted bread took me back to a distant morning when my daughter and I shared a glass of milk and laughed at nothing. I bought a coffee and a roll with butter, and the warmth of that cup brought me back to my hands. In the checkout line, I saw a bride on a magazine poster, veil fluttering, smile wide, and I had to take a deep breath to keep from crying. It wasn't sadness. It was awe. It was the shock of realizing that love ages us inside, but also saves us when we let it. Back on the bus, the road opened up into a long carpet, and the sky, now clear, felt like an extended blessing. I mentally counted the hours, the kilometers, the missed phone calls. Arriving at such and such a city. Is everything okay? Do you need me for anything? I wanted to stay out of the way. I wanted to be light, but this choice also had a taste of long-ago absence. Silence, sometimes, weighs as much as the wrong word. I stood there, torn between the fear of repeating history and the desire to write it differently. And the insistent song on the radio reminded me that every new beginning gives me butterflies. As dusk fell, the light turned golden and the shadows grew long, as if the road were stretching the day to give me time. I grabbed my phone, opened the front camera, and saw myself, my eyes mapped with fatigue, my mouth lined with stubbornness. Stay strong, I told the image, and put the phone away before my courage decided to hide. I caressed the blue fabric, smoothed the folds, adjusted the bow. It was just a dress, I know. But in that moment, it was also a silent plea for peace. It was my white flag. At the second-to-last stop, I bought a pair of simple earrings, a shiny, almost shy little thing. For you to wear today, I imagined saying, and I almost smiled at the scene I'd concocted. The two of us in the mirror, me behind, her in front, and a pleasant silence, the kind that happens when you sew. I glanced at my watch. It wasn't long now. My heart began to beat rapidly, and I counted to 7, as I'd been taught once, for the soul to return to its place. It did. Or it pretended to. Sometimes the soul pretends to return just so we can move on. When the city's bright lights finally appeared, my chest opened like a window on a summer day. The bus entered wide avenues, horns honking, people rushing, and I felt small and enormous at the same time. I booked a ride-hailing service, calculated the route to the hotel, imagined a florist still open, an improvised bouquet. There'll be time, I assure myself as if praying, and the blue dress, quietly on my lap, seemed to listen. I got out carefully, adjusting the handle of my suitcase and gathering courage in my shoulders. The bus station smelled of fried food and arrivals, and I stood there for a second, just watching people reunite. A hug here, a wave there, and the world seemed to fit in the palm of my hand. I took a deep breath, swallowed my fear, and walked to the automatic door as if passing through an invisible portal. Outside, the night greeted me with a warm wind, and I thought, this is it. This is the moment I meet my girl again. This is the moment I learn, the right way, the hard way, to say, my daughter. I arrived exhausted, but with my spirits lifted. The ride-hailing service dropped me off at the hotel door, and I almost ran to the counter. I wanted to drop my bags, take a quick shower, and head out in search of the party. The receptionist, with the calm of someone never in a hurry, handed me the room key. I rode the elevator with my heart racing, imagining people on the street, wedding horns honking, laughter echoing through the city's corridors. But there was only silence. A heavy, almost suspicious silence, as if the city were keeping a secret all its own. At the bedroom window, I flung open the curtains and stared. Nothing. Not a banner, not a song, not a card decorated with hanging cans. I found it strange. In small towns, every wedding is an event that disrupts the routine, brings color to the street corners, and gives the neighborhood something to talk about. But there, that night, all I could hear was the distant noise of a poorly tuned television and the hiss of streetlights illuminating the empty space. I clutched the blue dress to my chest, as if it could give me answers. And for the first time, I felt a strange tightness in the pit of my stomach. I decided to leave. I walked the streets, looking in shop windows, trying to find some clue. My shoes echoed on the sidewalk, and every corner seemed to mock my anxiety. I asked a young man closing his bakery if he knew of any weddings. He looked at me as if hesitating between saying or keeping quiet. No, ma'am. I haven't heard of any. I thanked him, but his tone held something else. Something hidden. I moved on, feeling the truth was just a step away, but I didn't want it revealed all at once. I stopped at a newsstand, feigning interest in old magazines. The friendly news vendor struck up a conversation. I asked bluntly, "Sir, can you tell me if there was a big wedding around here this week?" He scratched his head, adjusted his glasses, and, after an awkward silence, replied quietly, "Yes, there was, but it was 2 days ago." The world spun, the street disappeared, and I had to hold on to the iron counter to keep from collapsing. 2 days ago. My daughter. My blood. My life. And me there outside. His voice continued, but I only heard fragments. It was beautiful, so many people, the church was full. The words pierced me like invisible blades. I blinked hard to keep from crying right there, in front of strangers. The blue dress burned against my arms, heavy, useless, like a testament to my being too late. Too late not because of the road, but because of something much crueler, because of her. She wanted it this way. She planned it this way. And the whole town knew it, except me. I staggered back to the hotel, as if each step were a sentence. The hallway seemed longer, the elevator slower, the key heavier. I entered the room and dropped everything on the bed. I sat in front of the mirror, still in disbelief. No, it can't be. I mentally replayed every conversation, every phone call, every silence my daughter had said over the past few months. The long pauses, the short answers, the procrastination. And I realized it was all already written. I just didn't want to read it. I just didn't want to see it. In the early hours of the morning, I lay sleepless. The white ceiling became a canvas of questions. Why? Why didn't she want me there? What had I done that was so unforgivable? What hurt more, missing the party or being left out on purpose? The pillow was damp with tears. I didn't cry aloud. I didn't want to bear witness, even to myself, to the depths of the wound. I closed my eyes and listened, in the darkness, to the silence of the city, a silence that was no longer innocent, but complicit. The room phone rang suddenly, and my heart raced, thinking it was her. But it was only the front desk, telling me I'd forgotten my documents at the front desk. I went downstairs, my body heavy, and when the young man handed me my wallet, he said, "I'm sorry, ma'am." As if the whole town had a pact of mercy with me. As if everyone knew a secret that only I discovered too late. That simple phrase hurt more than any newspaper article. I'm sorry, but it wasn't compassion, it was confirmation. Back in a room, I sat on the edge of the bed and ran my hand over my blue dress. So beautiful, so full of anticipation. Now it seemed like a farce, a mockery. I thought about ripping it off, throwing it away, tearing this weight away from me. But I didn't have the courage. Because deep down, it wasn't just a dress. It was a symbol of my hope, my desire to be present, my misunderstood love. I held on tight and promised myself that I would never again deceive myself with silence. Never again would I ignore the signs. That night, I discovered that silence can be crueler than 1,000 harsh words. It cuts deep, but without noise. It kills slowly, without witnesses. And while the city slept peacefully, I lay at war. Not against my father, not against fate, but against something I couldn't yet name. I only knew that exclusion wasn't an accident. It was a choice. And the choice had a face, a name, and the blood of my own. My daughter. My own daughter. I woke with my eyes burning, as if the dawn had left embers hidden in my eyelids. The room was still silent, and I couldn't tell if it was early morning or if time had stopped deliberately to torture me. I sat on the edge of the bed with the blue dress around my knees, looking at him like an accomplice. He was also out of the party, also uninvited. And for a moment, I thought that maybe I wasn't the only one left out, but the thought pierced me like a knife. I was the only one. I picked up the phone, hesitated, and dialed her number. The call went straight to voicemail. I heard that recorded voice, cold, artificial, as if it were a barrier between us. I tried again and again, but nothing. Each unanswered call was a cruel confirmation. My daughter had erased me from the most important day of her life. I closed my eyes and whispered, "Why?" The question came out scratchy, without waiting for an answer. Because, deep down, I already knew no answer would come. I got up and walked down the street, looking for a familiar face. At the corner cafe, I asked a lady if she knew of any weddings. She adjusted her glasses, looked me up and down, and said, "My dear, that wedding has already happened." It was beautiful. There was even a shower of petals as we left the church. Her words were sharper than any knife. Petals. Music. A party. Everyone saw it. Everyone was there. Everyone except me. I swallowed the knot that was rising and walked back slowly, as if carrying an invisible body on my back. On the way back, the shop windows seemed to mock me. Mannequins dressed in white, artificial flower arrangements, colorful sweets on shelves. Everything reminded me of what I'd lost. Everything seemed ironic. I entered the hotel, almost exhausted, and the receptionist looked at me with pity. I hate pity. It never solves anything. It only casts us as victims, and I never wanted to be a victim. But in that moment, I felt diminished, shrunken, almost transparent. A mother who traveled 900 miles to be forgotten. I slammed the bedroom door shut. The bang echoed, and the tears came unbidden. I didn't cry quietly. I cried loudly, like someone rebelling, like someone protesting against fate. But soon the anger mixed with something worse, a cold, silent emptiness that paralyzed me. It was as if someone had ripped a piece of me out without anesthesia. I asked myself, what mother isn't called to her own daughter's wedding? What mother deserves this kind of punishment? The question throbbed, but there was no answer. I looked in the mirror and saw my face disfigured by pain. Deeper wrinkles, red eyes, a twisted mouth. That image frightened me. Is that what she sees in me? I thought. Maybe so. Maybe I am that bitter reflection I never realized. I leaned my forehead against the cold glass and felt a pang of hatred mixed with love. Is it possible to love someone so much and at the same time want to scream at them until you lose your voice? I discovered that it is. I discovered that love, when wounded, can bleed anger. The news that everything had already happened 2 days ago gnawed at me. 2 days that detail wouldn't leave my mind. 2 days in which I still dreamed, still traveled, still believed. 2 days in which she was already a wife and I was still preparing to be the mother of the bride. 2 days in which her world went on without me, while my own world spun in circles. It was as if I'd lived in a parallel time, in an illusion cruelly sustained by her silence. I sat back down on the bed and closed my eyes. Flashes came to me helping her pick out dresses when she was a child, me braiding her hair for school, me holding her hand through the early morning fevers. Each memory cut me like glass. I had always been there, or so I believed. And now, at the most important moment, I was discarded as if I had never been part of the story. As if my role had ended. As if I were just a burden to be left behind. I remembered the times we argued, the words that were thrown at us, the silences that never healed. Perhaps each of those moments had built a wall between us, and I never realized how much it was growing. Now that wall was insurmountable, and at the top of it was written, "Excluded." That word throbbed in my chest like a hot iron. I wasn't just forgotten. I was excluded. I was erased. I lay down, exhausted, with the blue dress still draped over me, and fell asleep exhausted. Sleep came heavy, filled with disjointed images. A packed church, my daughter smiling at everyone but me, petals falling to the floor, and my feet stuck in the cement. I woke with a scream stuck in my throat. And for the first time, I accepted the harsh truth. It wasn't carelessness. It wasn't a mistake. It was intention. My daughter didn't want me there, and I still didn't know why. The next day, my eyes still heavy with sleepless tears, I went down to the hotel cafe, trying to mingle with the other guests. The smell of fresh bread and hot coffee brought back memories, as if the past had decided to follow me there. I reached for a cup, but my hands were shaking so badly I almost spilled it. That's when I heard two gentlemen talking at a nearby table. They were laughing, talking about the beautiful wedding the day before yesterday, about the unexpected presence of the bride's father. My spine froze. My heart, already broken, found another crack. I stood paralyzed, listening unnoticed. One of them said it was moving to see the father entering the church beside his daughter, crying like a child. The scene formed before me like a dagger, piercing my flesh. Him. The man I'd painted as a villain, the man I said had abandoned his own daughter. He was there, sitting in the front row, occupying the place I'd dreamed of my entire life. I closed my eyes for a moment, but the image wouldn't leave. My daughter chose her father, and she didn't choose her mother. I swallowed hard and returned to my room without finishing my coffee. I closed the door behind me and slid to the floor, hugging my knees. My mind whirled between anger and disbelief. How could she? How dare she place beside her the very man who had never been there? But then, a crueler thought crossed my mind. What if he wasn't exactly what I'd always said? What if my version was just one of the versions? The bedroom mirror seemed to stare at me ironically, as if it knew I was no longer so sure of my own stories. I spent hours remembering the times I'd spoken about him to my daughter. Every word filled with resentment, every accusation I'd thrown at that man. I always said he'd abandoned us, that he'd run away from us, that he'd never wanted us. And she believed it, at least I thought she did. Now I realized that perhaps she'd begun to doubt it long ago. Maybe every bit of anger I'd thrown had been a door that pushed my daughter away from me and closer to him. That evening, I walked to a nearby square, trying to clear my head. The yellowish streetlights illuminated couples strolling, families eating ice cream, children running around. Everything seemed normal, except me. I sat on a cold bench and watched others' lives go by, while my own seemed suspended in midair. In my mind, the words of one of the men at the cafe echoed. It was so beautiful to see her father there. It was like they'd never been apart. My stomach churned. My daughter had made a point of presenting the world with a perfect image, without me. I shuffled back to the hotel. The blue dress was still draped over the chair, a silent witness to my defeat. I ran my hand over the fabric and whispered, I was supposed to be there. My voice was shaky, almost childish. I felt a wave of indignation wash over me, but then a greater emptiness came, as if someone had ripped out my insides. My daughter chose to believe him. She chose to sit next to the person I'd spent years telling her couldn't be trusted. What else had she discovered? I picked up my phone, took a deep breath, and wrote a short message. I want to understand. That's all. I didn't send it. I deleted it. I wrote again. I'm at the hotel. Can we talk? I deleted it again. The fear of being ignored paralyzed me. Silence would be crueler than a harsh response, and I couldn't bear another one. So I put the phone away and cried silently, embracing my own fear. It was strange to realize I no longer knew if I had the right to demand anything. Lying in bed, I remembered when she was a child, waiting for her father to show up at school parties. He never showed up, and I comforted her with stories that he didn't care. Now, the memory tasted bitter. Did he really not care, or had my version always outweighed the reality? My chest burned. Maybe I had been as cruel as he had been. Maybe even more so. This doubt gnawed at me from the inside out. In the bathroom mirror, I washed my face and stared at my own wrinkles. For the first time, I wondered, what if my daughter had seen something in him that I never wanted to show? What if, in trying to protect her, I had only poisoned our relationship with hurt? Her silence, her exclusion, her father's choice, they was all part of an answer I didn't want to accept. He wasn't just invited. He was honored. And I was discarded. I went back to bed, but sleep wouldn't come. I kept repeating in my mind, Father was there and I wasn't. That phrase became a hammer, pounding on my conscience until it nearly drove me mad. And deep down, I knew it wasn't just about absence. It was about the truth that was about to be revealed. A truth I'd already dreaded hearing. The next morning, I woke with my face swollen and my throat scratchy from silent crying. The room was filled with a strange smell, a mixture of cheap perfume from the hallway and the sea air wafting in through the barely closed window. I went to the bathroom, turned on the faucet, and let the water run, but when I looked up at the mirror, I barely recognized myself. The woman staring back at me looked older, tired, as if she'd carried decades in a single night. The blue dress hanging on the chair reflected in the background, reminding me of the shame of being there, out of place, forgotten, rejected. I pressed my cold hands against the sink and stared at that image, as if facing a sentence. The lines around my mouth looked like furrows carved by anger. My sunken eyes betrayed sleepless nights and heavy memories. For years, I'd seen myself as the victim of the story, the mother who struggled alone, the abandoned woman. But there, in that mirror, something snapped. I could no longer sustain this narrative without asking myself, did my daughter see only pain in me? Only resentment? I sat on the cold bathroom floor and let the tears flow uncontrollably. With each sob, I remembered moments when my daughter would look at me with a certain discomfort, a look I mistook for defiance, but which was perhaps a silent plea for peace. How many times had I yelled louder than I should have? How many times had I chosen to win the argument instead of listening? How many times had my ego spoken for me? The cruelest question came like a whisper. What if I had become the burden she always wanted to be free of? I stood up and approached the mirror again, as if to delve deeper into my own image. I touched my face with my fingers, but what I felt wasn't just skin. It was hardness. It was the mask I'd constructed to avoid appearing weak. I remember telling my daughter that she needed to be strong, that we couldn't depend on anyone. But wasn't I, in that speech, just hiding my poorly treated wounds? Had I, in my attempt to be an example, become a prison? I returned to bed, lay on my side, and hugged the pillow. The distant sound of cars on the street seemed to mock my loneliness. In that moment, I realized it wasn't just about losing my wedding. It was about losing the mirror of my own identity. Everything I believed myself to be, a devoted mother, a resilient woman, a warrior, was crumbling in the face of her absence. If my daughter didn't want me by her side on the most important day of her life, what was left of me? Who was I, after all? I grabbed my phone and opened old photos. Her and I on her 7th birthday, with chocolate cake and crooked candles. Her and I on the beach, laughing with our feet covered in sand. Her and I on the couch, watching cartoons and sharing popcorn. In these images, there was affection. There was life. But looking at them now, I wondered, did she cherish those same memories with tenderness, or was there already pain behind her smile? Doubt was a dagger twisting inside my chest. I tried to convince myself there was still time, that nothing was lost. But the truth is, the mirror was already broken. And when a mirror breaks, we can glue the pieces back together, but the reflection never comes back together. I remembered the phrase I'd repeated to her so many times. It's just the two of us against the world. Today, that phrase felt like a prison. Maybe she grew up wanting to escape this fortress I'd built without realizing it. Maybe I'd suffocated her while protecting her. The sun began to flood the room, and the light hit the blue dress. It seemed to mock me, as if witnessing a broken promise. I picked it up with trembling hands, pressed it against my body, and for the first time, I felt anger toward it. Anger toward that object that held my expectations, my fantasy of being part of something that never happened. I threw the dress on the bed and left it there, like a symbolic corpse. I didn't have the courage to keep it, but I also couldn't bring myself to throw it away. I sat in the armchair and stared into space. The room seemed to shrink, the walls closing in, and the feeling of suffocation was unbearable. I closed my eyes and listened to my own heavy breathing. Inside me, there was an insistent voice. You also made a mistake. You also pushed someone away. You also hurt someone. I wanted to silence that voice, but it wouldn't. And deep down, I knew it was the voice I had been running from my entire life. I opened my eyes and stared into the mirror again. The invisible shards were there, scattered throughout my soul. There was no more pretending. I needed to understand who I truly was, without masks, without fabricated versions. But would I have the courage to look so deeply? Could I bear to see the mother my daughter saw in me? I stood in front of the mirror for a long time, trying to piece together the shards of my own image. But the longer I stared, the more memories came flooding back, as if the glass reflected not the present, but the past. I remembered the countless times I'd sat my daughter on the couch and spoken ill of her father. I'd told him he was a coward, that he'd abandoned us, that he didn't deserve to be called a father. Those words came easily, sharply, as if they brought me some relief. But now, with swollen eyes and a crushed heart, I began to wonder, was I speaking to protect her or to feed my own wounds? Memories came flooding back. I remembered when she was still little and would ask, "Mommy, why doesn't Daddy come see me?" And I would respond bitterly, pouring my anger into her innocent mouth. I believed I was being sincere, that I was telling her the truth. But what if, in truth, I was just using my daughter as a platform for my resentment? Looking back now, I see that each venomous response may have planted seeds of pain that germinated within her. I lay down on the bed and closed my eyes. Scenes came to me where I screamed louder than I should have, exploding for no apparent reason. I remember my daughter's frightened face, huddled in a corner, unable to understand the reason for the storm. I always justified it by saying it was exhaustion, the hard life, the pressure of raising a single parent. But now, with my mind free of excuses, I realized that much of what she suffered was a reflection of my wounded ego. I didn't accept my limitations, I didn't seek help. I preferred to be the martyr. I ran my hand through my hair and sighed deeply. How many times had I promised myself I would be different, that I would talk less and listen more? And how many times, in practice, did I repeat the same mistakes? The truth is, I fed myself into this victim role because it was easier to blame others than to look within. While I pointed the finger at my absent father, I hid my own flaws behind a wall of pride. And my daughter grew up in this harsh environment, believing my distorted truths. I opened my purse and pulled out an old box I always carry with me. Inside were letters I'd written on lonely nights but never sent. They all spoke of him, all spewed sorrow. I thought I was venting, but in reality, I was only fueling a flame that burned within me and was reflected in my daughter's eyes. I leafed through those yellowed pages and realized each word was a brick in the wall that separated us. And now, that wall seemed insurmountable. I got up and paced around the room like someone trying to escape themselves. My footsteps echoed, recalling old arguments, slammed doors, silences that wouldn't heal. Suddenly, I heard her voice in my head, repeating phrases she'd said so many times. "Mom, stop it. Mom, stop bad-mouthing him." And I, stubborn, replied, "You'll understand." Today I realize it wasn't her who needed to understand. It was me. I was the one who needed to let go of the weight, heal the wounds, let the past die. I sat in the armchair, hugged the blue dress, and cried like a child. The soft fabric couldn't hide the harsh truth that was now revealed. I wasn't just a victim. I was part of the problem. Perhaps I'd so distorted the memory of who I was and who he was that my daughter grew up not knowing what was true and what was fabricated. And when she finally heard the other side, it all made sense to her. a painful feeling, but a feeling nonetheless. I thought about how many times my daughter must have felt suffocated by my versions. I always wanted to be right, always wanted to be the loudest voice. But what she needed was a mother who listened, not one who spouted venom. The memory of that crushed me. I had the power to be a safe haven, but I was often the storm. The clock struck noon, and the sun streamed through the window with an uncomfortable brightness. The bright light illuminated the entire room, as if trying to expose even the darkest corners of my consciousness. I hurriedly closed the curtains, unable to bear so much revelation at once. The silence returned, but this time it wasn't just absence. It was accusation. It was the echo of my own distortions returning to haunt me. I looked in the mirror again, but I no longer saw only wrinkles and fatigue. I saw stories poorly told, words poorly spoken, choices that hurt more than they protected. The mirror no longer reflected the mother I thought I was. It reflected the mother my daughter had perhaps always seen, a woman trapped in her own resentment, unable to free herself. And in that distorted reflection, I realized I had to choose: continue living in the lie I'd created, or have the courage to face the truth. 2 days after I sank into silence, I received a short message. "Can we see each other tomorrow?" It was from her, my daughter. The letters shone on my phone screen as if they burned my eyes. My heart raced, my hands sweated, and for a moment I considered not responding. I was afraid of hearing from her everything that was already torturing me inside. But I simply typed, yes. I spent the entire night awake, rehearsing conversations, imagining hugs, making apologies, and, deep down, fearing the worst. The meeting was scheduled at a discreet cafe, away from prying eyes. I arrived early, as I always had my whole life, and thought nervously about the napkin. The sound of the clinking cups seemed to hammer in my head. When the door opened and she walked in, my heart nearly stopped. She was beautiful, radiant, but there was something cold in her gaze. She wasn't the same girl who ran into my arms when I got home. She was a woman raised above my flaws. She sat across from me, unsmiling. Silence was the first guest at the table. I opened my mouth to say something, but couldn't find the words. Then, with a firm voice, she cut through the air. "Mom, I heard Dad." The world stopped. The waitress passed by, serving coffee to another table, but I heard nothing but those words. I heard Dad. Everything I had was there, in the center of the table between us. I swallowed hard and tried to react. "Daughter, you know he always..." But she asked for silence. For the first time, she silenced me. And it was in that gesture that I realized how much I had lost. "Mom, he told me his side of the story. And as hard as it is to admit, some things make sense." My chest opened, my breath short. I wanted to scream that it was a lie, that it was manipulation, but a shadow inside me confirmed, yes, some things made sense. The coffee seemed to shrink, the air thicker. I watched her stir the cup, not meeting my eyes. That gesture killed me more than any words could. "You always told me he abandoned me, that he never cared. But, Mom, what if it wasn't like that? What if he just couldn't live with you?" Her words fell like stones in my lap. I trembled, clutching the napkin until it ripped into shreds. There was no denying that this possibility had always haunted my thoughts. My daughter finally hid her gaze. There was no hatred, but there was a distance that chilled me. "I started noticing things, Mom, your outbursts, your silences, your attempts at everything. I always managed to make it normal, to make it cared for. But now I see there was something wrong. I just didn't know." I felt a pang in my heart. I wanted to defend myself, to say I did the best I could, but the words wouldn't come. Because deep down, I also knew there was something wrong with me. The waitress brought 2 waters, and I barely managed to thank her. My daughter took a sip and continued, in a lowered voice. "I'm not saying he was perfect, but the way you always talked about him, it seemed like there was something more. It seemed like you were hiding something. I crumbled inside. Because she was right. I hid. I hid my unhealed wounds, my directionless anger, my bruised ego. And, worse, I used his image to explain my own failings. With each sentence she said, I leaned deeper into my chair. It was as if my daughter held a mirror before me, forcing me to see not only what I'd always avoided, but also how she saw me. Mom, I didn't want to believe him, but some pieces fell into place. Pieces that had been loose my whole life. I felt the ground disappear beneath my feet. The world spun, and I didn't know where to stand. I looked at her with teary eyes and whispered, I never meant to hurt you. She took a deep breath and replied, I know, but you hurt me anyway. Those words tore through me. There was no scream, no historical accusation. It was just the calm, cutting realization of a daughter who finally saw her mother beyond the stories. When she cried out and said I asked her to leave, I wanted to grab her, beg, explain. But I remained motionless, because in that moment, I realized that any word I said would sound offensive, not loving. And love, perhaps, was precisely what was most lacking in my actions. I watched my daughter walk out the door and didn't look back. And I, alone in that cafe, felt that the true judgment was yet to come. I returned to the hotel after that encounter with shaky legs, as if every step were taken on broken glass. I spent the night awake, reliving every word, every silence, every look from my daughter. In the morning, when I finally managed to take a sip of coffee, my phone vibrated. It was a message from her. I want to tell you what Daddy told me. My heart raced. The air felt thin, as if the world had been chosen inside my chest. I took a deep breath and simply replied, I'm ready. But I knew I wasn't. We met again, at the same cafe. She arrived serious, without makeup, as if carrying a weight. She sat down and began bluntly, Mom, he told me about you, about what it was like living with you. Those words were enough to cut me open. I swallowed hard, trying to sound firm, but my hands were shaking. He said you had difficult behaviors, that sometimes it was impossible to live with you. My entire body froze. I wanted to laugh, mock, deny it, but I remained speechless. She lowered her eyes and fiddled nervously with her spoon. He used a word, borderline. He said you never found help, that you always decided to admit any problem. My heart sank. That word echoed inside me like a death knell. How many times had I heard people say that behind my back? How many times had I mentioned therapy, and I'd snapped back with wounded pride? My reflection in the window stared back at me, betraying everything I'd tried to hide my entire life. He explained that he tried to get closer several times, but you backed away. That every gesture turned into a fight. That ego always spoke louder. My daughter pronounced each sentence like someone digging up bones. I shifted in my seat, unable to meet her gaze. Part of me wanted to scream, bullshit, but another part knew there was truth to it. Because I remembered. I remembered the arguments, the control, my unhealthy need to be right. She took a deep breath and continued, Mom, he didn't say that to turn me against you. He even asked me to understand you. But I started connecting the dots. My throat burned. It was like every memory of her was a knife coming back to stab me. When you exploded for no reason, when you suffocated me deliberately, when you made me feel like I was defrauding you, it all makes sense now. I saw it as love, but maybe it was just unresolved pain. I looked at her, trying to hold back the tears. Daughter, I did what I could. The sentence died in my mouth because it sounded fragile, worn, almost cowardly. She didn't answer. I just stared with teary eyes, the eyes of someone who discovered a truth too hard to bear alone. We felt the distance between us grow, even sitting at the same table. It was as if we were on different continents, separated by an ocean of sorrow. The silence was heavy. The waiter brought me a coffee, but I couldn't drink it. My hands were cold, my heart pounding. For the first time, I wasn't the one with the most convincing version of the story. It was him, the man I'd condemned for years now to surgery as someone who, despite his flaws, was perhaps simply incapable of living with me. Shame enveloped me completely, like a suffocating blanket. My daughter then uttered a sentence that pierced me like a bolt of lightning. "Mom, maybe you were never just a victim. Maybe you were also guilty." The ground fell away. My body trembled. I wanted to defend myself, but I realized any word would sound like an excuse. And, in that moment, I had no more excuses. All that remained was silence. We left the cafe, without hugs, without promises. She left quickly, while I stood on the sidewalk, watching the cars pass by. The cold wind bit my face, but the pain came from within. Every word she repeated about her father was a window into my consciousness. I didn't want to look, but I couldn't close my eyes any longer. The truth was before me, naked and cruel. Perhaps I'd spent my entire life running from myself. I returned to the hotel room and sat on the floor, hugging the blue dress. The fabric smelled of mildew and tears. For the first time, I said out loud, "What if it's true? What if I've been part of the problem all along?" My voice echoed through the empty room, and in that echo, I felt the weight of decades of silence fall upon me. I returned home carrying a suitcase that felt much heavier than when I left. It wasn't the blue dress that weighed me down, nor the memories of the trip. It was the burden of my daughter's words. Every sentence she repeated about her father lodged inside me like a stone, piling up until it suffocated me. I closed the door and sat on the couch, staring into the empty living room. The silence, which had once given me a false sense of control, was now a sentence. I could no longer escape the truth. For days, I kept replaying everything I'd experienced with my daughter. The unprovoked outbursts, the exaggerated scoldings, the moments when they demanded obedience without explanation. I remembered when she was a teenager, and I'd say, "Mom, you complicate everything." I'd get angry, telling her she didn't understand anything about life. Today, those words sound like prophecy. She's already realized what I denied, that I was an enigma, a labyrinth of unresolved pain. And she grew up trying to find a way out. I dug out old photo albums and spent hours looking through them. In the portraits, there were frozen smiles, but I knew what lay beneath. A trip where I fought with her in the car, a birthday where I yelled because the table wasn't set how I wanted, a party where I isolated myself because something bothered me. Each photo seemed to accuse me. What to others was just a memory was now evidence to me. Evidence that my love had always been laced with poison. The words borderline behavior wouldn't leave my mind. I've never liked labels, always rejected any diagnosis. But what if I'd imagined this sooner? What if I'd sought help instead of hiding behind pride? Maybe I'd learned to manage my emotions. Maybe I'd been lighter. Maybe my daughter wouldn't have felt so heavy. But no. I chose to cling to my ego, and the ego doesn't heal anyone. It only builds walls. In the following days, I felt my body react to the pain. I woke up tired, with chest pains, as if my heart were carrying stones. Food was tasteless, and sleep was interrupted by confusing dreams. My daughter watching me from afar, my ex laughing contemptuously, and me trying to run, but stuck in shifting sand. I woke up sweaty, feeling like I was never going anywhere. The revelation wasn't just psychological. It was physical. It was a real weight crushing me. I began to remember little scenes I'd previously ignored. My daughter's weary expression when I insisted on talking about her father. The way she'd look away when I started an argument. The silence after my outbursts. All of this now had a new meaning. It wasn't rebellion. It wasn't ingratitude. It was exhaustion. It was her heart telling her she couldn't take it anymore. And I didn't listen. I didn't want to listen. One day, I sat in front of the living room mirror and said out loud, "You failed." The sentence echoed like a gunshot. I, who had always considered myself a victim, must admit that I was also a perpetrator. My whole life, I pointed the finger at my absent father, unaware that my presence often also hurt. It was an almost unbearable pain to consider this. But it was the only truth left. And truths don't disappear just because we don't like them. With each memory, the weight grew. It was like carrying a stone inside my chest that couldn't be let go. And the cruelest thing was knowing that my daughter, by excluding me from the wedding, didn't just want to punish me. She wanted to free herself from the burden I represented to her. That thought destroyed me. Being seen not as protection, but as a prison. Not as a lap, but as a burden. I, who fought so hard to be everything she had, ended up being exactly what she wanted to leave behind. I couldn't bring myself to call her for days. The phone was there, within reach, but it felt like a bomb about to explode. What could I say? I'm sorry? That word doesn't erase decades. I love you. The love that suffocates doesn't console. I'll change. Would she believe it? Maybe it was too late. The weight of the revelation wasn't just knowing what I'd caused. It was knowing there might be no going back. And in the silence of my living room, hugging the blue dress that had never left my suitcase, I cried like never before. But it wasn't a cry of anger anymore. It was a cry of conscience. Of someone finally realizing that the greatest prison wasn't abandonment, nor the exclusion of marriage. The greatest prison had always been myself. And now, with the walls crumbling, I didn't know if I would be able to rebuild. Those were days of silence. I no longer had the courage to look for my daughter, but I also couldn't bear her absence. The phone seemed to beckon me from the living room table, as if each imaginary ring were a punch in the gut. Until, one cold night, she replied to one of my old messages. It was short, blunt. "Mom, I gave you the wrong wedding date because I didn't want you there." I held the phone in my hands, staring at those words, as if they were fire. I read and reread them dozens of times, trying to find room for interpretation. But there was none. It was raw, direct, definitive. My legs felt weak. I sat on the floor, weak, hugging the blue dress I'd never worn. A shiver ran down my spine, but it wasn't cold. It was anger, pain, and disbelief all at once. How could she have the nerve? How could a daughter exclude her own mother from such a sacred moment? The echo of her words repeated in my head like a hammer. I didn't want you there. It wasn't a coincidence. It wasn't a mistake. It was punishment. On the first impulse, I wanted to call. I wanted to scream. I wanted to return with sharp words. I wanted to cast the weight of my grief upon her. But my voice wouldn't come. I was speechless, as if the revelation had taken away not only my place in the marriage, but also my voice. I felt as if I'd been slapped, leaving no mark on my face, but an invisible wound in my soul. I, who had always seen myself as indispensable, had been discarded by my own daughter. I lay on the couch and stared at the ceiling. The paint stains seemed to form faces, memories, fragments of our life together. Me holding her when she learned to walk, me running with her on the beach, me crying in secret when she started school. How was all of this not enough? How had so many years of dedication become a source of revulsion? The questions piled up, but no answers came. Only the cruel silence of the message. The next day, I summoned the courage to ask, why? The answer came a few hours later. Because I needed to let go, Mom. I knew you'd turn my party into another arena for your pain. I didn't want to carry that on the most important day of my life. The words were sharp knives, but they also carried a logic I couldn't deny. It was true. I would have tried to control details, criticized choices, cried over my emptiness. Perhaps, unintentionally, I would have turned her wedding into a stage for my wounded ego. I spent the day walking around the house like a shadow. I touched the framed photos, the scattered mementos, and realized that each one told an incomplete story. In each, there was my version, my narrative. But hers? Where was it? Where did my daughter's perspective fit into the memories I kept like trophies? Now I understood. While I collected photos, she collected wounds. That night, I lay hugging the blue dress. It had become a symbol of my punishment. I'd chosen it so carefully, dreaming of that moment, and it ended up being the object that reminded me every day that I wasn't invited. The soft fabric seemed to mock me. It was as if saying, "You were never there. Never." I cried myself to sleep, exhausted, but the weight of the revelation stayed with me even in my dreams. I dreamed I was at the church door, my blue dress shining in the sun. But the door was locked. From inside, I heard laughter, music, applause. I knocked, I begged, I shouted her name. No one opened the door. I woke with a dry throat and tears in my eyes. It was just a dream, but it didn't have to be real. It had already happened. The exclusion had been concrete, planned, and executed with precision. The next morning, I sat at the table with a cup of cold coffee and found myself repeating under my breath, "She punished me. She wanted to punish me." Saying it out loud was like signing a sentence. My daughter didn't just want to protect herself from me. She wanted to punish me. It was her way of returning years of pain, of silencing my truths, of putting me in the same place I put her father, on the sidelines. The difference is that with him I invented it. With me, she executed it. And for the first time, I accepted that that emptiness wasn't an accident of fate. It was the bitter harvest of seeds I'd planted myself. I just didn't know yet if I'd have the strength to pull them from the soil of my life, or if I'd spend the rest of my days nurturing the roots of guilt. In the first few days after my daughter's message, anger was my only companion. I paced the house like a caged beast, muttering to myself, repeating angry phrases. How could she do this to me? I didn't deserve it. She was poisoned by her father. These words burned inside me, and each time I said them out loud, it was like adding fuel to an already blazing fire. I wanted to blame her. I wanted to blame him. I wanted to blame the whole world. Anything was better than looking at myself. One afternoon, I couldn't take it anymore. I grabbed my phone and wrote a long text, accusing her of ingratitude, saying that one day she would regret it, that I had given my life for her. My hands shook with anger, my eyes red with tears. But before sending it, I read it out loud. And for the first time, I heard the tone. It wasn't love. It wasn't pure pain. It was wounded ego. It was pride disguised as justice. And this recognition paralyzed me. I deleted everything, crying like a child. In the mirror, I saw myself again, but this time it wasn't just wrinkles and fatigue. It was the shadow of my anger reflected back. My mouth was pursed, my eyes narrowed, my body tense. I recognized myself in that expression. How many times must my daughter have seen that same face at home? How many times was that expression enough to make her feel rejected, suffocated, punished without guilt? It was at that moment that the anger began to give way to awareness. That night, I sat on the living room floor, hugged the blue dress, and cried differently. It was no longer a tear of hatred, but a tear of recognition. Each drop that fell seemed to dissolve a layer of my pride. I understood that my daughter hadn't acted merely out of cruelty. She had acted for survival. To avoid repeating for the rest of her life the feeling of being under the weight of my control, my resentment, my anger. The punishment she inflicted on me wasn't just punishment. It was liberation for her. Still, it wasn't easy. My body reacted with impulses of hatred. Sometimes I woke up wanting to blame her, to write long letters accusing her father, to gather witnesses to my suffering. But soon after, emptiness would come, an inner silence that said, "And what does that solve?" And I realized I was faced with a choice. Either I would feed the anger and lose my daughter forever, or I would transform this pain into something that could, perhaps, rescue at least a piece of what we were. I began writing in a notebook. Not accusatory texts, but confessions. I was wrong when I yelled at you. I was wrong when I used you to vent my anger at your father. I was wrong when I thought being a mother meant always being right. Each written sentence was like pulling out a thorn that had been embedded for years. It was painful, but also soothing. I realized that perhaps the only way to keep my anger from destroying me was to transform each hurt into words, each word into awareness. My ego still pulled at me. I often found myself rehearsing excuses that, deep down, were justifications. I wanted to say, I only acted that way because your father hurt me. I only made a mistake because I was lonely. But I realized this was pride in disguise again. A true apology can't be explained. It can only be acknowledged. And that was the hardest battle, silencing my pride to hear the truth. As the weeks passed, I realized my anger was giving way to a strange kind of bitter peace. It wasn't resignation, it was clarity. I understood that life was offering me a choice I'd put off for decades: face my wounds or continue hiding behind them. My daughter, by excluding me from the wedding, sent me the most painful message of all. And I finally understood. If I didn't change, I would lose her forever. One night, looking out the window at the sky, I whispered, God, help me not to turn to stone. Help me not to let anger swallow me. And in that instant, I felt something inside me shatter completely. It wasn't just the mirror. It was the entire wall crumbling. For the first time, I accepted that I needed to change, not to prove anything, but to rescue myself. And so, the anger that had nearly consumed me began to transform into a calling. A call to a new beginning, to an inner journey I'd never dared to undertake. I knew it wouldn't be easy, but I also knew there was no other way. The love for my daughter was still alive, and if I didn't learn to tame my ego, that love would be buried along with the blue dress I never saw in church. I returned home with my bag intact. The blue dress was still folded, never having fulfilled its purpose. I laid it on the bed and stared at it for long minutes, as if it were a tombstone. It was silent proof of everything I hadn't experienced. There were no photos to show, no memories to cherish, no laughter to remember. I hadn't been there. I hadn't seen my daughter walk down the aisle. I hadn't heard the vows. I hadn't witnessed the final embrace. I returned with only the echo of an absence that seemed to scream within me. The silence of the house hit me like a punch to the chest. Every room felt emptier than before, as if the walls knew I'd lost something irreparable. I sat on the couch and closed my eyes. I imagined what it would have been like if I'd been at the wedding. The sound of the music, the smell of the flowers, the sound of the applause. But they were just imaginations, projections that didn't fill the void. What I had weren't memories, they were ghosts of what could have been. I opened an old drawer and found photos of my daughter's birthdays. In all of them, I was beside her, sometimes smiling, sometimes deadly serious. I ran my fingers over the images and felt a pang in my heart. How did we get to this point? How did the girl who so often clung to my neck to sleep become the woman who excluded me from the most important day of her life? The memories that once made me proud were now like needles stuck in my throat. In the kitchen, I made coffee, but the smell, instead of comforting me, suffocated me. The emptiness had a taste. It had a smell. It had a shape. It was like a shadow that followed me through every room. I felt that, even accompanied by objects, mementos, and memories, I was alone in a new way, alone from what truly mattered. Alone from her presence. Alone from her embrace. That night, I sat on the bed with the blue dress on my lap. The fabric felt like it weighed tons. The silence was so intense I could hear my own breathing, labored, as if I'd run a marathon without moving. I grabbed my phone, scrolled through my daughter's old messages, and realized there wasn't a single photo of the wedding. Not one. She wouldn't send it to me, wouldn't share anything. I didn't even have a single image to pretend I'd been there. This absence was cruel. In the days that followed, I began to notice how her absence seeped into everything. I'd pick up my house key and remember how she'd once said, "Don't forget your coat, Mom." I'd look in the living room mirror and remember the days when she'd rush to get ready for school. Now, everything was silent. There were no voices, no laughter, no life. Her emptiness haunted me like a faithful ghost. The most painful thing was knowing that this emptiness wasn't the result of a tragedy of fate, but of her own choice. My daughter decided to erase me from that moment, and this gave the absence an unbearable weight. It wasn't just the physical absence, it was rejection. It was the certainty that I wasn't wanted. The emptiness, in this case, was active, intentional, and it gnawed at my heart. I remember one afternoon sitting on the porch and looking at the sky. The clouds drifted slowly by, and I thought, she's somewhere now, maybe laughing, maybe remembering the wedding. And I'm here, forgotten. This thought overwhelmed me. It was as if there were two worlds, hers, full of life, and mine, frozen in silence. I was no longer part of her universe. I began talking to myself around the house, as if trying to fill the void. You should have called me, daughter, you should. But I soon realized it was no use. The absence couldn't be filled with words. There was no return, no correction. I had missed the moment, and that moment would never return. This awareness was like carrying a stone in my heart every day. At that point, I understood that emptiness can be crueler than any physical pain. The pain still screams, still shows that we're alive. The emptiness doesn't. The emptiness swallows, consumes, silences. And there I was, with the blue dress tucked away in my bag, discovering that the worst thing wasn't missing the wedding. It was missing the presence of the one I loved most in life. After days of walking around the house like a ghost, I realized the emptiness wouldn't go away on its own. It followed me from waking up until dawn, and the more I tried to escape, the more it surrounded me. That's when I decided to stop running. I sat on the living room floor, turned off my phone, closed my eyes, and let the memories come. All of them, the good and the bad. For the first time, I didn't fight them. And it was at that moment that I began to dive into myself, into deep waters I'd always avoided. The first images that came to mind were from when I was still a girl. I remembered my own mother, the harsh words, the icy silences, the love that always seemed conditional. I realized that, unintentionally, I had repeated patterns I swore I would never repeat. The scream that had so often wounded me as a child now came from my mouth toward my daughter. The disapproving look I hated was now the same one she received from me. It was as if I had inherited wounds and turned them into chains. Each memory tightened my chest. I remembered when my daughter was little and, impatiently, I'd leave her crying alone. I remembered when she'd ask for attention and, tired, I'd tell her to wait. I remembered the times she'd try to tell me her dreams and I'd interrupt with my own dramas. These memories came like knives, but also like revelations. I wasn't just a mother wronged by life. I was also the mother who failed, who hurt, who left scars. The plunge deepened when I thought about my outbursts. I said it was just my temper, just the way I am. But deep down, it was accumulated pain, harbored resentment, an ego that refused to let go. My daughter grew up in this harsh environment, and I, blinded by my victim narrative, didn't realize how much I was suffocating her. In the silence of that room, I finally faced that shadow. And it had my face. I ran my hand over the blue dress, still draped over the chair, and realized it symbolized more than a lost marriage. It was a reflection of everything I'd missed out on experiencing with ease. It was as if each fold of the fabric held an unresolved memory, a forgiveness never asked for, a hug never given. I cried, but not with anger this time. I cried with recognition. It was the pain of someone who finally sees their own reflection naked, unmasked. The following nights were the same. I'd lie down and, instead of falling asleep, close my eyes to revisit every part of my life. It was like walking through dark hallways and opening doors I'd avoided for years. Behind them lay memories I'd hidden even from myself. Words that hurt my daughter. Threats spoken in the heat of anger. Unfair comparisons. The icy silence of days I'd chosen to ignore rather than embrace. It was a painful but necessary plunge. At times, I wanted to give up. I wanted to go back to believing the problem was just his father's, the world's. It was easier to blame others. But something in me had already changed. My daughter's voice in the cafe echoed. "Some things make sense, Mom." And I knew that, as much as it hurt, she was right. It was time to stop running. There was no turning back from this plunge. One day, staring into the living room mirror, I asked myself aloud, what if the problem had always been me, too? The phrase echoed like thunder in the empty house. It wasn't just any question. It was an invitation to break out of denial. I felt a chill run through me, but also a strange sense of relief. Admitting the possibility was a start. It was like opening a crack of light in a dark room. In this process, I realized I never sought help because my ego wouldn't let me. I said I didn't need it, that I was strong, that I could handle it. But the truth is, I was afraid. Afraid of discovering that the problem lived within me. Now, faced with my daughter's rejection, I had no choice. Either I dive in or I drown in the void. And so, amidst tears and silence, I decided I needed to face my pain head-on. The dive wasn't just about understanding my daughter. It was about understanding myself, about healing myself, because without it, I would continue to relive the same wounds until my last breath. I woke up early on a bright day and felt, for the first time in a long time, a different kind of courage. Not the usual get-it-done courage, but a gentle, sincere courage that came with the humility of someone who accepts their own limits. I picked up the notebook where I'd written my confessions and read aloud phrases I'd previously kept to myself. Then I made an appointment. My heart was pounding, my hand was shaking, but each step toward the office seemed to untie an old knot in my chest. I entered that room as if admitting a secret. I was ready to run away no more. In the waiting room, I felt ashamed. I remembered everything I denied about myself. I don't need therapy. I'm too strong for this. Some people suffer more. These voices came like nails on a board. When they called my name, I took a deep breath and felt a mixture of relief and fear. Relief that I'd finally done something for myself. Fear of what I'd find. I sat across from the professional with my hands clasped and said, I want to understand why I am this way. The sentence was small, but it truly carried weight. The first few sessions were strange. I talked and talked, and for the first time, there was someone who organized my words without judgment. She listened and sometimes asked just one question in return, and that made me think in a new way. I remembered childhood memories I'd buried, repeated stories I'd told with pride, and discovered cracks in them. With each session, I felt some of the dust accumulated on my memories being swept away. It hurt. It hurt to clean the shelves of my soul. But it hurt less than when my daughter ignored me. During a meeting, the therapist calmly discussed the diagnosis, without crushing labels. She explained that there were patterns of outbursts of fear of abandonment, of intense reactions to rejection, and that everything could be treated. Hearing the word possible was like an open window. It wasn't a sentence, it was a path. For the first time, the idea that I could learn to manage my emotions stopped being a fantasy and became a plan. Taking a deep breath became a goal. Receiving a name for what I was feeling was both strange and liberating. Not because the label defined my soul, but because it provided a map for the journey. As soon as I understood that some of my reactions stemmed from old patterns, a comb-through began to form within me. It was possible to untangle them without losing myself. I learned breathing techniques, exercises to pause before exploding, and exercises in curiosity about the sensation itself. Why am I so agitated right now? Instead of reacting automatically. The first practices yielded small, discreet, almost imperceptible, but real results. One day, my daughter called me, and I didn't feel the need to respond immediately. I breathed, counted to 7, and responded calmly. She didn't notice anything special, just heard a less tense voice. I, however, felt as if I had crossed a river without drowning. Small crossings like these began to give me the courage to continue. Every pause I took before speaking was a silent victory. There were setbacks, of course. Some triggers would explode, and I'd find myself in a familiar place. Immediate reaction, followed by justifications. During these setbacks, I'd cry, blame myself, and sometimes almost give up. But the therapist reminded me that change is a process, not magic. Threads pulled and remade. I learned to forgive myself for the setbacks and to return to my inner work with more patience. The compassion I began to have for myself was an unexpected gift. It smoothed the process and made me more whole. Over time, my view of my daughter's father changed as well. Where I once saw an enemy, I began to see a human being with limits. Not that I excused everything, but I understood that stories have sides and that my version wasn't the only truth. This openness allowed my memories to lose the unique color I'd given them. By toning down the accusatory tone, life became less burdensome, and, slowly, I began to understand why my daughter approached him that day. One day, I wrote a letter to my daughter that I didn't send immediately. In it, I put everything: acknowledgement, regret, small examples of what I was changing. I didn't send it for fear of sounding dramatic. I preferred, first, to be consistent with my new attitudes. But keeping the letter gave me a new perspective. I didn't need to promise miracles. I just needed to show, over time, that I was moving. And this silent care gave me more hope than any fiery speech could have. Today, months later, I'm not the same. I still have thorns. I'm still frightened by silence. But I already know I can take care of myself without dying from it. The first step was admitting my failure and asking for help. It was painful, humiliating at times, but liberating. I know there's a long road ahead, and I don't promise miracles. I just promise to walk it responsibly, with love, and with humility. In the first weeks of therapy, I realized that my greatest enemy wasn't my daughter, my ex-husband, or life circumstances. It was my own ego, that hardened pride that had made me believe for years that I was always right, that my suffering gave me a special right to hurt, that my pain justified any outburst. Facing this was like looking into a cracked mirror. Each crack revealed a piece of myself that I'd hidden, but that had always been there. The following sessions were even more intense. I relived abandonments I'd never gotten over. The day my father left home, the time my mother called me dead weight, the friendships that had fallen apart because of my outbursts. Remembering all of this was like being stripped naked in front of a mirror. But there was one difference. I wasn't alone. For the first time, there was someone guiding this process, holding the thread as I descended into the labyrinth of my soul. And it was during this deep dive that I began to perceive a new movement within me, a sincere desire to change. Not to convince my daughter, not to clean up my image, but because I could no longer bear living trapped in patterns that only brought pain. The new beginning began small, with simple gestures, speaking more softly, listening more, breathing before responding. But each gesture was a new brick, building a different version of myself. In the bedroom mirror, I noticed changes. It wasn't in the wrinkles or gray hair, but in my gaze. For the first time, my eyes weren't filled with anger or pride. There was a spark of serenity, still shy, but real. I began to touch my own face more gently, like someone learning to embrace themselves. This was also what starting over was, learning to be my own mother since I'd never had one. Sometimes the pain returned sharply, reminding me that my daughter was still far away. I wondered if she would ever see these changes. The fear of her indifference was enormous. But I learned that I couldn't live waiting for applause or recognition. The new beginning was, above all, for me. so that I could breathe without the weight of so many masks, so that I could exist without being merely a reflection of my wounds. There was a day when I dreamed of my little daughter running around the yard with a doll in her arms. I called her name, and she came smiling, hugging me fearlessly. I woke up crying, but this time with hope. The dream felt like a message. I still had the capacity to be a lap, to be affectionate, to be a home. This image became my guide. Perhaps I would never recover the lost marriage, but perhaps I could rebuild the bond in other moments, in small dinners, in brief conversations, in embraces I had relearned. The new beginning wasn't grand. It wasn't spectacular. It was made up of small things. Organizing the house more carefully, cooking for myself with love, walking slowly through the streets, smiling at strangers. These simple things, which I had previously despised, now became victories, because they meant I was finally learning to live without the weight of resentment. That's what a new beginning was, the slow rediscovery of myself. And deep down, I knew, if I could keep this path, maybe one day my daughter would see it. Not like someone watching an actress rehearsing excuses, but like someone witnessing a real transformation. Until then, the new beginning was mine. A gift life forced me to accept after ripping away what I loved most. After so many therapy sessions and sleepless nights facing my ghosts, I realized that one question wouldn't leave me alone. How would my daughter know I was changing if I didn't open my heart? It was then, one silent dawn, that I sat at the kitchen table with a cup of cold tea and began to write. It wasn't a defense letter. It wasn't another attempt to convince. It was, for the first time, a silent plea for forgiveness. The pen trembled in my hand. I wrote slowly. Daughter, I'm not writing to you to explain, but to acknowledge. I failed. I hurt you more times than I realized. I turned my pain into chains and bound you with them. Today I see this, and it hurts more than I can put into words. With each sentence, tears stained the paper, smudging some of the letters. But I didn't tear. For the first time, I accepted that even my imperfect words carried truth. I continued. I don't want you to forgive me now. I don't want you to feel obligated to hug me or welcome me back. I just want you to know that I'm trying to change. I'm seeking help. I'm shedding my pride. I'm learning to breathe before I speak. All of this isn't to erase the past, but to build a different future if you'll let it. The silence in the kitchen seemed to hear every line, as if witnessing the most important confession of my life. When I finished, I folded the paper and put it in a drawer. I didn't have the courage to hand it over. The simple act of writing was, in itself, a cry for liberation. I knew I couldn't rush my daughter, nor demand anything of her. Perhaps she would never read those words, perhaps one day I would deliver them, but at that moment, the value of the letter lay in its being born, not in its being received. It was my silent plea, kept like a shrine of hope. In the following days, I began writing short, light-hearted, non-demanding messages. I'm thinking of you. I hope you're well. I saw a flower today that reminded me of your childhood. These weren't attempts to justify anything, just reminders that my love still existed, even from a distance. Sometimes she'd respond with a short sentence, other times she wouldn't respond at all. But even her silence no longer destroyed me in the same way. I knew that time needed to work alongside my actions. One night, I picked up the letter again and reread it aloud. I felt ashamed of some words and wanted to change others. But I decided to leave it as it was, raw, imperfect, human. Because that was how I was becoming. Less of a mask, more of a truth. Keeping the letter wasn't giving up. It was trusting that if it ever reached my daughter's hands, it would be at the right time, and with the strength of someone who doesn't justify themselves, but lays themselves bare. I began to carry with me a kind of mantra. No excuses, just requests. Whenever the urge to blame my father or defend myself arose, I would breathe and repeat these words. Gradually, I realized that this exercise brought me greater calm. Silence ceased to be absence and began to be space. Space for my daughter to observe, without pressure, what I was trying to build. The silent request wasn't just for her. It was for me too. It was a way of reminding myself every day that I no longer wanted to live trapped in my ego, that I accepted my flaws, but I didn't want them to define my demise. The letter became a symbol of my commitment to change. It didn't need to be read to fulfill its purpose. It simply existed. And deep down I knew the true message wasn't in the written words, but in what I would do from then on. Every calm gesture, every choice of silence over outburst, every small token of love would be, in itself, a living letter sent to my daughter. Perhaps one day she would open her eyes and see. Until then, my request would remain hidden, waiting for the right time to be revealed. The following months were a kind of fertile silence. There were no grand gestures, no emotional reconciliations, but there were small, almost invisible signs that showed me that time was beginning to work in my favor. My daughter still didn't contact me often, but occasionally she responded to my short messages. Sometimes it was just an okay, sometimes a simple emoji, but for me it was like receiving a drop of water in the middle of the desert. I began to learn to respect this rhythm. Before, I was demanding, wanting quick answers, wanting proof of affection. Now, every little reaction from her was received as a gift. I discovered that haste was the enemy of healing. It was like trying to open a flower by force. The result would only be destruction. I learned to wait. I learned that silence can also be caring, a distant care, but still caring. During this time, I began to take care of the house in a different way. I cleaned out old drawers, organized albums, and cooked dishes I hadn't made in years. It wasn't to fill the void. It was to remind myself that I still had life, that my existence wasn't limited to being away from her. Each simple gesture was a way of telling myself, "You're still here." I discovered that time not only heals wounds but also restores our awareness of our own worth. On some Sundays, I sent neutral messages. "I hope you're well. I thought of you today." She didn't always respond, but the simple act of writing calmed me. I no longer wrote expecting a response. I wrote because I wanted to show constancy. I wanted her to know that, despite the distance, my love remained. And suddenly, I realized that love, when it demands nothing in return, has a strength I'd never experienced before. Time also brought reflections. On long walks alone, I realized that part of the pain I carried stemmed from my difficulty accepting limits. I'd always wanted to control the pace of things, to determine how and when everything should happen. Now, learning to wait for my daughter's response was also learning to wait for life's response. It was a hard lesson, but profoundly transformative. One afternoon, I received an unexpected message. "Mom, I saw a recipe you used to make. Can you send me the instructions?" My heart almost leaped into my throat. It wasn't an invitation, it wasn't forgiveness, but it was a link, a small thread that was being woven together again. I calmly shared the recipe, without exaggeration, without extra comments. I'd learned that sometimes less is more. And that day, her request was so much more than any rehearsed excuse could have been. Time also began to heal the wounds I'd kept open within me. I began to blame myself less, to understand that acknowledging mistakes doesn't mean living forever chained to them. Little by little, I replaced paralyzing guilt with active responsibility. I couldn't change the past, but I could act differently in the present. This understanding brought me a new peace, which began to be reflected in my actions. The therapy sessions continued, and each week felt like another stone was lifted from my chest. The therapist constantly reminded me, "Be patient. Your daughter observes more than you realize." And that phrase stayed with me. I knew she was paying attention, even when I wasn't responding. Every change in me was a silent message sent to her. Time, in this process, was the translator of what I couldn't express in words. I began to realize that even her silence, no longer hurt me in the same way. I learned to embrace this space, to transform it into a moment of self-discovery. The void stopped being just absence and became an opportunity to grow, to mature, to strengthen myself. It was as if time was healing not only the relationship, but also my relationship with myself. Today, looking back, I see that it wasn't forgetting that brought me here, but quite the opposite. It was the constant, painful memory that forced me to change. Time didn't erase anything, it illuminated it with greater clarity. And little by little, it taught me that healing doesn't happen in a day, but through the sum of small gestures, small pauses, small choices. Every morning I didn't give up, every night I didn't succumb to despair, was part of that healing. A year had passed since the wedding. A year of silence, of short messages, of long waits. I was already getting used to the idea that we might never be as close again. Then, one ordinary afternoon, while tidying the kitchen, I heard my phone vibrate. It was a message from her. "Mom, shall we have dinner tomorrow?" I read it so many times that the words began to lose their meaning. My hands sweated. My heart raced. I could hardly believe it. I spent the night awake, imagining what it would be like. I thought about what to wear, what to say, even the tone of voice I would use. I wanted to appear calm, but inside I was a storm. I prepared every detail as if it were a secret ceremony. My hair done, the perfume saved for special occasions, the simple but lovingly chosen outfit. More than ever, I wanted to convey lightness. I didn't want to repeat the weight that had driven her away from me. The meeting was at a discreet restaurant. I arrived a few minutes early and sat at a reserved table. The place smelled of fresh herbs and soft music played in the background. Every time the door opened, my heart leaped. Until, suddenly, there she was, entering with firm steps, her face serene. When she looked at me, there was no coldness, but neither was there the old familiarity. It was a new, curious, observant look. She sat down, ordered a juice, and for a few seconds we sat in silence. I took a deep breath, trying to control the urge to talk nonstop. Then she broke the ice. "Mom, I can see you're changing." Those words were like a bomb. They weren't forgiveness, they weren't complete reconciliation, but they were recognition. And recognition, coming from her, was worth more than any applause in the world. We talked about simple things: work, food, childhood memories. Nothing deep, nothing heavy. And I forced myself not to bring up old topics, not to justify the past, not to ask for anything, just to be present. It was difficult. My ego wanted to open wounds, wanted to show regrets, wanted to hasten the healing. But I silenced it. And in that controlled silence, I realized that love can also be quiet, patient, without spectacle. At one point, she laughed at an old story, and that laughter lit up the entire night. It was like hearing music after years of silence. I couldn't help but smile too, but without exaggerating. I just let my heart feel it. That laughter was proof that there was still something between us, something that neither pain, nor mistakes, nor absences could completely destroy. At the end of dinner, when we stood up, she gave me a brief hug. It wasn't long, it wasn't tight, but it was a hug. And in it was a silent message. It's not all healed yet, but it's not lost. I returned home with that gesture engraved on my body, like someone carrying an unexpected blessing. That night, I stared at the blue dress still tucked away in my closet. I didn't cry. For the first time, I looked at it without feeling only pain. It was no longer just a symbol of what I'd lost. Now, it was also a reminder of what could still be rebuilt. We might never have our marriage back, but we had something more precious: the chance to start over, to reinvent our bond on other occasions. I fell asleep with a peace I hadn't felt in a long time. It wasn't the peace of someone who's regained everything, but the peace of someone who's taken a real step, however small. And I understood that sometimes reunion doesn't happen in grand gestures, but in simple details, an unexpected invitation, a shared laugh, a brief hug. And in those details, hope lies. The morning after dinner, I woke up different. The sun filtered through the curtains with a gentleness I hadn't seen in a long time. My heart still carried the warmth of my daughter's brief embrace. I sat on the edge of the bed, looked at the blue dress folded in the closet, and for the first time, I didn't cry. I touched the fabric with steady hands, and instead of feeling pain, I felt gratitude. That dress hadn't been worn to the wedding, but it had accompanied me on the most difficult journey of my life, facing myself. As the days passed, I realized that overcoming grief wouldn't come from immediate forgiveness, nor from a magical reconciliation. It would come from constancy, patience, and each choice made in silence. I began to walk the streets with lighter steps, to cook for myself slowly, to laugh alone at small memories. It was as if I was learning to exist outside the role of victim and also outside the role of accuser. I discovered that when we embrace our humanity, the weight begins to lift. In therapy sessions, I talked about dinner. The therapist smiled and said, "Do you realize that hug only happened because you changed the way you're present?" I reflected on this. For years, I'd sought presence by demanding, pressing, imposing. Now, the reunion had come just as I'd learned to silence my ego and create space. It was a lesson I've never forgotten. Sometimes, to gain, you have to let go. Overcoming also came in the form of acceptance. I accepted that my daughter has the right to love me in her own time, in her own way. I accepted that we may never be what I idealized, but that we can still be something real, even if imperfect. I accepted that the past cannot be erased, but it can be redefined. And, above all, I accepted that the most important fight was not against her father, nor against her. It was against the shadows I myself created within myself. Today, when I look back, I see that I didn't just lose a marriage. I gained the opportunity for rebirth. I discovered that my greatest enemy has always been my pride, and my greatest victory was learning to set it aside. I'm not saying I've won forever. I still stumble. I still feel the temptation of anger. I still have days of painful silence. But now I know how to get back up. I know how to ask for help. I know I don't need to hide my flaws behind masks. Overcoming, for me, doesn't look like a grand victory. It looks like small gestures, the chosen silence, the breath before responding, the brief hug that's worth 1,000 words. Overcoming is waking up and realizing that I no longer feel that crushing emptiness. It still exists, but it no longer defines me. Today, I know I can be more than my pain. I know I can be a mother who made mistakes, but who also had the courage to rebuild herself. Deep down, I understand that my daughter didn't punish me just for revenge. She gave me, with her absence, the chance to find myself. It was cruel, it was hard, but it was necessary. The marriage without me was the breaking point that forced me to face everything I'd hidden for years. And, paradoxically, that was the beginning of my healing. The exclusion became an invitation to rebuild myself. Now, I keep the blue dress as a reminder not of failure, but of rebirth. It bears witness to the fact that life can be turned upside down, but it can also be stitched back together, thread by thread, with patience. And each thread I weave today is made of cleaner, more conscious, more human love. Perhaps my daughter will one day see this clearly. Perhaps not. But regardless, I already see it. And that, for me, is overcoming. And so I end my confession. I didn't win against the world, nor against my daughter. I won against myself. And in this silent victory, I found the path to a peace I never imagined I'd feel.